Alright, so the next stage is to attach some of the bindings so that you've got, so you'll start with this section here. You've got your sear attached here over the front of the backing, and you want to make it look like this one here, where it's bound nice and tight over the edges. This will make sure that the sear remains attached and doesn't come loose. If you have a vise, that makes everything a lot easier. So mix up a small portion of the epoxy. And apply it very liberally over the edges. So it's acting somewhat as a filler as well as a glue. Mix up a nice amount there and put it at least up to that point there where the end of the sear hits the wood. Now with the second spool that you have, I'm using a complete one here, but you'll have the second one that has less on it. You're going to use this to bind it up. So start about half an inch below the end of the sear and try and loop it off so you've got a good start. So you want to bind it nice and tight, so there's a little bit of give in the Dacron, so you can tell when it's nice and tight because it will stretch just a fraction, and that's how tight you want it. You want to get it so tight that you can't get it any tighter on there. Now this start section here where it's beveled down towards the back of the bow, you want to have quite a lot of binding here because this is the most important part, and this needs to be as tight as possible. So I would bind it as tight such that there's only a very small gap between each thread as you're going around. Now when you get to the end, use a bit of the epoxy to smooth down the edges of the fibers. On the belly here, apply just a little bit there as well to seal it off. Now the next section is binding the handle. So apply some of the epoxy to the midsection here. To the sides, back of the handle, if you have a vise, very helpful. Again, with the binding around the midsection, pull it as tight as you can until you can feel the Dacron starting to stretch. The handle doesn't have to be quite as densely bound as the Sears, so you can probably have about a maybe 1 or 2 millimeter gap between each wrap. This section will be covered by the leather handle strap that you have, so it's not necessary for this to look particularly tidy, it just has to be functional. For the midsection of the handle, I would bind it a lot more densely, so that is each fibre coming around and pressing up against the next fibre, and make sure you're pulling it nice and tight so that you can feel the Dacron stretching around and gripping the wood. When it's bound, it should look more or less like that. Heavy binding in the very center of the bow handle and less binding around the sides. Leave it to dry for about 24 hours.